we just published something we never thought we would publish in the New Yorker, another piece by Joe Mitchell, and it's no secret that there's another piece of about that length and maybe one a bit shorter that'll come out down the line. How did it come about? We thought that Joe Mitchell had stopped publishing in the early 60s, mid-60s, with Joe Gould's Secret, and there would never be another thing again.
Well, David, what happened was, you're right, he did stop publishing. Joe Gould's Secret came out in the fall of 1964, and then nothing. And, you know, Joe was working on things. He was pursuing stories about people he cared about very much, a woman named Ann Honeycutt, who was sort of a woman that was very well known to the New Yorker men. He was pursuing,
Could you elaborate? Because
let's just say it involved Thurber, Gibbs, McElway, and a cast of thousands. So she was a very interesting woman. He was pursuing the idea of a story about his dear friend Joe Cantalupo, who is one of the key figures at the Fulton Fish Market. He was pursuing a lot of things, but he wasn't really finishing anything. And ultimately, he decided he would write somewhat. He took an autobiographical turn. He thought maybe what he wanted to write a big story about New York, a book-length story about New York. And he didn't really like writing about himself, but ultimately he decided that this was perhaps the only way I could do it. So this was in the late 60s, early 70s. He sat down and he started producing, it's funny because you go into the files, he's literally re-reporting his life from North Carolina on. But he wrote the piece that you saw, that you published. That was the first chapter. And the second chapter, which I think you'll publish down the road a bit, is more, takes him back to his childhood. And the third piece becomes kind of a bridge back to the current time. So, and that's all we have, as far as I know, unless something else surfaces. And he, like everything else, he got into it and he stopped, and he put it away, and that's where it stayed until in 1995, Up in the Old Hotel came out, and to great acclaim. And he was so.
Should say that that's a collected works, yes, and everything anthology. Before that, the only way you could get Joe Mitchell's books were in used bookstores.
That's right.
Yeah.
And if any of you in the crowd, if you're interested enough in Joe to be here, you definitely need to have the book Up in the Old Hotel. And he pulled these stories back out because he thought, well, maybe, I could get these into publishable shape. Unfortunately, shortly thereafter, he became sick and died. And they went into his files again.
Well, Mark, you took on an almost impossible assignment in 1999, which is to write a profile of somebody who was gone and to try to figure out the predicament that remained a mystery for years and may still be a mystery, which is why Joe Mitchell stopped publishing in 1964 and continued doing something for 30-odd years. What was the nature of the mystery? What did you make of Joe Mitchell and his predicament where writing was concerned, and his life? What was his life in those last 30 years?
His life, I think, is as described in the piece in this week's issue. I think that he was on a quest. I think that he was literally wandering all over New York in a way that reading about it is whether he's recreating Ulysses in his wanderings or not, who knows, but he's looking for something, and it's a spiritual quest, of course. I mean, that's what's literally there. I didn't have the benefit of that, of course. I only knew really what I'd read of his work and what I tried to learn from his work. So I knew generally how he felt about New York. I knew how he felt about the modern world and what change meant. And I don't know how, someone said something to me, it was like a water cooler conversation at the magazine one day that made me think, well, and it came up with the title, which happens to be the title of this event tonight, but it was the title of the piece, which was Joe Mitchell's Secret. Obviously a play on Joe Gould's Secret, and what was that secret, if anything? And I'm not a critic, I'm a reporter, and so all I could appreciate his writing, but really I approached it as a reporter, and what I learned was that he didn't stop writing. he had certainly not stopped trying. I went to see his daughter, Nora Mitchell Sanborn, who lives in New Jersey and is a lovely person, and she welcomed me, and we talked about whatever. I didn't talk to Joe's other daughter, Elizabeth, who lives in Atlanta, but what I got from Nora was she took me back to a bedroom where there were these jars. There were bowls and there were jars, and they were marmalade jars mostly. He had marmalade every morning for breakfast, with breakfast, and in them were pieces of paper and found objects, and he was cataloging what he had found either in New York or in North Carolina, and these things I realized as I went through them, the detail, they weren't just, rusty nut, or something like that. It was where he found it, near whose farm, and he would tell you a little bit something about the neighbor's farm, and it was all these just scribblings. And this was a compulsive thing with him, clearly. I had a conversation with Nora yesterday, thinking about what we were going to talk about today, and she told me something that Tom has known, was that I knew that he went out with a sheet of paper and pencils in his jacket, and he always wore a suit, of course. And I knew that when he went out, anything just we can.
So you and me.
It's me, I'm sure. I knew that he went out.
There we go.
With a piece of paper and a pencil, basically. What I didn't know was that he was keeping a diary, which you've seen, and what he would do was he would go home, he would write down whatever he wrote down, and people would hear him at the old office on 43rd Street, either 25 or 20 West 43rd, typing during the day. But when the cleaning woman came in at night, the desk was blank. Whether there was anything in the wastebasket, I don't know. But there was no evidence of what was going through his typewriter. And part of it was this diary. And I was at least able to say, most importantly in that piece that I wrote, that he never stopped trying. And I think there's something inevitably poignant about both what you find in the writing itself, the stories that he writes, and then, of course, in his life.
And Sandy, when you read the piece, none of us had read this piece other than Tom until very, very recently. What did you make of it? What did you make of its literary quality? What advance, or if any, he was making as a writer? And did it solve any mystery about Joe Mitchell as such?
Joe was a kind of a religious person. He was not religious, and he was in a context where nobody that he hung out with, I think, was very religious. But he was an agnostic about disbelief. That is, he wasn't so sure that there wasn't something after death. There's a passage in this where he says, he thinks that maybe the fires of hell are real. So he was kind of a theological writer. And what this piece did for me was to show how seriously he took it. I mean, I don't know exactly what the time frame of this piece is, but I knew Joe and went drinking with him on a couple of occasions. And on one of them, we were just sitting there talking about the words to Protestant hymns, and he didn't say at the time, I go to Mass constantly. I go to like 10 different Masses, He's describing, he goes to all these different Masses. And there's a part in this piece where he just keeps going to all these different churches. And it seems to me that he got to a point where he might have had to take a kind of Tolstoy step to actually become sort of a religious figure, maybe even. I mean, why are we here? Because he's a really heavy guy, Maybe he could have taken that next thing, and he just, no, wait a minute, that's not possible. But there's a part in this piece where he goes into St. Patrick's, and he looks up above, and he says 70 feet up are the hats of the previous cardinals. And there are 3 up there, and then he says there's now 4 because Cardinal Spellman has since died, and his hat is up there too. And he goes and he's looking at it, and the priest says, well, would you like to come behind this velvet rope and take a better look? And he steps past it, and he looks up, and then, or before that, he has said the priest is talking to a washerwoman who is scrubbing the steps. Now, normally you would just say she's scrubbing the steps, but he says scrubbing the steps with Old Dutch cleanser. And that's where you just go really deep. I mean, Mr. Hunter says, you know, in the piece about Mr. Hunter, there are Bible passages where you go so deep you can't get to the bottom. Well, Old Dutch cleanser, you know, what is the history of the city? It's a Dutch city originally. And what is Joe? He says, I'm not a Catholic. And then when he talks about how he goes back when he's at the Mass, and he says, I go back before the Reformation. Well, he's a product of the Reformation. He's a Protestant. I believe he was a Baptist. So that and John Calvin was Dutch, right? So here he is, an Old Dutch cleanser, and suddenly you've gone way back. You've gone below kind of the steps below the floor of the church almost. You've gone into the history of the city. He was out there, and he was really looking for something. And I found the piece, I was sorry that it ends and there's nothing that follows it. But I felt I loved the piece, and I thought it cast a huge amount of light on his previous pieces. And it just made me think, you know, somebody like Joe, they are in progress. You know, it's like, when the poet dies, he belongs to his readers, you know? Well, Joe belongs to us now, and he's developing. We're not done. He's not done. And this piece, and I really look forward to the other 2, it's like, where is this writer going, and how is he going to be seen as time pulls back from him, and as you see him with a wider context? So I didn't feel, you know, frustrated with this piece at all. I felt like it's something that will be read and reread, and, you know, you'll get more out of it every time. I think it's wonderful that piece turned up and that it was published.
Tom, as a biographer, what did you learn from that piece? Just is it possible to glean any notion of his state of mind, his circumstances, on the question that bewitches any biographer of Joe Mitchell, from this and the 2 to come?
Well, I think Sandy put it very well from the standpoint of Joe was he was born a Baptist. He was very much formed, you know, from sort of these Southern fundamentalist practices and beliefs. And even though, you know, shall we say he outgrew them later, he never really got past them. And he was a constant seeker. He really did, you know, believe there was something else out there. He wanted to know more about it. And so on that level, I mean, that, you know, it certainly validated that. And I agree. In fact, the first time I ever read it, I'm a Catholic. I was floored by the image of the mitres up in the ceiling. And the fact, not long after, I actually, you know, walked to the cathedral when I was in New York and, you know, to find them. It's just, but as a biographer, the other thing you have to remember that I learned from that piece, or it underscored, this was written in the late 60s, early 70s, and Joe, remember, he hadn't published then in 5-6 years. He was prone to depression all his life. And this was about this point in his life where he was so discouraged by what was happening in the city. I mean, New York, think about it, you know, late 60s, what was going on in America, what was going on in New York. And
what was the nature of the discouragement, though?
Well, don't forget, I mean, for one thing, he just loved the architectural patrimony of the city, and New York was just hell-bent on knocking down every building of consequence, it seemed, you know, that was still there. And for him, that was just such a painful metaphor for what was happening with his city. He came to New York right at the beginning of the Depression, so his New York was the New York of the 30s, the 40s, the 50s. For many people, it was sort of this magical time, and by the late 60s, he just almost couldn't take anymore what was happening with his New York, and so he starts talking about living in the past. And so his New York that he writes about in that piece, even though we don't know for sure, but it really is much more of a New York that unfolded for him while he was here. So I think it's more of that New York looking in the rearview mirror. It's wistful and melancholy.
We have two writers here who write beautifully about New York and who are not from New York, as most New Yorkers are not. Mark is from Oklahoma and Sandy is from Ohio. When you read Joe Mitchell writing about New York, you must feel some kind of outsider kinship, or a person who arrives in the city, or maybe not. I don't know.
I never compared myself to him, so it's not the same thing. I just think about what I learned from him, and what I learned was about listening. He was the best listener anyone who met him ever encountered. Sandy and I both had the experience of going out to drink with him and finding that in my case, I'm a short hitter, so it was about one martini in, and I had just assumed control of this conversation and was just spouting idiocy, I assume. And Joe was just leaning forward, yes, oh, yes. And you just keep talking. Well, as reporters, we want people to talk. And the way you do that, reading him, it was implicit to me that the way to be a reporter was to shut up most of the time, to get out of the way of the person that you're talking to. The ideal interview is one, if you have a tape of it in which, the reporter's voice is heard as little as possible. It's not quite psychotherapy, but it's something in there. And then just detail. I mean, I wasn't only learning that from Joe. I think Sandy, I don't know in what order you read. I know you said that when you came here, you and I were both in our early 20s when we came to the magazine, and I hadn't read anything. And so I was just inhaling New Yorker reporting at that point, and Liebling obviously was the other person that I was learning from. But that was more about character. How do you describe people? And humor was essential to all this. That was the fundamental lubricant in all of this. We've been talking here in a sort of a dour way about how somber and poignant Joe is. He was incredibly funny. All these pieces, there's every kind of humor in them, and so it was a textbook example. But you could only do what you could do.
Yeah, I think that it's when I first came here, I really couldn't hear very much because I didn't hear New York that well. It doesn't sound like where I came from. People talk differently. And what you try and do is, as a reporter, find the thing that you can hear. And that's, you're not just looking out, but you're looking into yourself and saying, what is my aptitude for? And with Mitchell, he was going around and finding out how he fit in. And it was similar to, for me, I grew up in a rural place, not as rural as where Mitchell grew up. But it does take a lot of adjustment just to feel like, what is going on here? And for Joe, I think a lot of it was looking for the natural world, which is very, very vivid here. This is one of the great natural places on the planet in terms of the combination of fresh and salt water, and the combination of land and an archipelago that's just perfectly situated for a harbor. It's just, and a confluence of rivers. It's just a wonderful place in the natural world. And it has lots of birds, and it has lots of fish. It has freshwater and saltwater fish. It has all kinds of nature, and it's getting more nature. We've now got wild turkeys in New York City. I mean, I could go on and on. And what Mitchell was doing was finding something that corresponded to what he knew. And I think I took a lead from him in that.
I want to mention that when you describe wildflowers and birds and things like this that you're identifying in your pieces, it really pisses me off. You,
It's the only reason I do it.
I know.
Mark
And-
is not going to know what Japanese honeysuckle is, and
No,
he's going
and
to be
I-
bugged.
I couldn't even find it on Wikipedia. And Joe, and he talks about this, like, I like to take a wildflower book and a couple of sandwiches and wander, through a cemetery. And then he does identify all these things. And there's a moment in this piece in the magazine when he does that somewhere in the Bronx. He's looking at some little
Right, yeah.
You do that too. And as I say, it's a personal thing with me.
You take it as an affront, as it is meant. But, yeah, he can, he knows vastly more than I do. And that wildflower section in Mr. Hunter's grave where he says what wildflowers are there, I was just astonished, and I got a wildflower book, and I went to Mr. Hunter's grave.
Yeah, this is it.
And of course, it was the middle of winter, so it was very hard to identify anything.
There's not as many.
Can I
of
just
these
say,
things.
only a guy from Ohio goes in the middle of winter looking for wildflowers. What kind of activity?
Well, it's global warming. A lot of things are out now that didn't used to be. And and then I went to the Sandy Ground Historical Society, and they had a film made of that cemetery in 1980, and you couldn't see the graves. There were so many. If you know this wonderful piece, and if you haven't read it, it's the greatest piece, in my opinion, ever written. But we went out there. It's exactly the same as Mitchell described it. And Mr. Hunter, when he's talking to Mitchell, points out this graveyard, this tombstone of this guy named Dawes Landis. And I went to the church there, Mr. Hunter's church, which is an African Methodist Episcopal church, and it's still operating. And I met Dawes Landis's great-great-granddaughter. Mr. Hunter says, he tells the story of Dawes Landis, and he says, this guy, he was an oyster man, and then he retired, and he did this, and he did that, and he had an orchard, and he had a peach orchard, and he had a peach that was a champion peach. He would take it to various, state fairs, and he said, and this peach was the greatest peach, and the name of this peach was Stump the World. And I was there and reading that because I took the book with me. And I look at this old weathered thing where Mitchell says on the tombstone, it says, asleep in Jesus. Long gone. That's long eroded away. But the name is still there. And to know that all of this incredible wealth of knowledge about this place is all Joe's. He found it. And Mr. Hunter, when he takes him to his grave, where he will be buried, it has his wife's name and the year of birth and death of his wife. And then it has Mr. Hunter's year of birth, but it doesn't have his year of death. And he says, of course, after I die, this will be added on here. But, Mr. Hunter at that point was 85, and he didn't die for another 10 years after that. But anyway, he says, my name will be added on here, and it's still blank. They never did add the year of his death.
Tom, you just heard Sandy describe Mr. Hunter's grave as maybe the greatest piece ever written. And right now, there are a lot of people around that think of Joe Mitchell as a real king, a real master of nonfiction. And yet, until the mid-'90s, you couldn't find his books. Part of your job as a biographer, writing a literary biography, is a biography of a reputation in time. Why was he a secret? Why was he a cult figure rather than somebody that was in print and available and whose reputation had been sustained not just by a small clutch of writers and admirers, but a broader readership?
Well, it was largely a self-inflicted wound. And let me just say, I agree. I don't know whether Mr. Hunter's grave is the greatest story ever, but in my opinion, of all the wonderful stories that Joseph Mitchell wrote, I think it's the best, in part because it's doing the same thing that Shakespeare does. Sandy quoted this wonderful line, Mr. Hunter talking with another minister about some of these biblical passages that go so deep you can't go any deeper. And the story does it works on level after level after level, and of course you don't know it going into the story where you're going to end up. and it really is, it's just taking this unbelievable journey. It's so rich that, again, if you haven't read it, do yourself a big favor. It doesn't take that long. When I say self-inflicted wound, David, basically the reason Joe went out of print was because he would not he would not let the publishers keep him in print. A part of his concern was that he had seen, Liebling was his great friend, he had seen reissues of Liebling's work in what Joe thought were, not that great paperback form. They didn't tend to get a lot of critical notice when reissues came out. There was a piece of him that didn't mind that he was a kind of a rarity to find. And so I talk about it in my book. I mean, publishers begged him his entire life to let them bring out reissues of the books, or the anthology. And he was even quite reluctant at the end. It was Dan Frank at Pantheon, the editor, wonderful editor, who finally broke through, and Joe acceded to, and thank goodness for Dan.
What did he promise? What was it that made him change his mind?
Well, interestingly, and Dan's a clever guy, he wrote Joe. Dan was a young editor at the time. Joe was an old man, and Dan, they hadn't met, but Dan said, "Could I please take you to lunch? I promise the one thing we won't talk about is reissues of your book."
So he did what editors do, which is just lie.
Yes, lie. As
Make
you know,
unreasonable
right.
promises, lie, and then
Exactly.
push.
Exactly.
Excellent.
And therefore, and they did, and they went and they talked about everything under the sun except reissue, and they established a relationship, and he made it happen. But Joe, when he always thought the books would be reissued, and when they were, he actually liked the idea of the anthology he had for some time, and that it would be hardcover, be really substantive. So, but it wasn't that people didn't want him. I mean, it wasn't that they forgot him. He just wouldn't let them.
You talk about this publication, and it led to, I think, the happiest literary event I've ever seen in New York. There was a wonderful bookstore on 75th and Madison called Books and Company. Kind of a posh bookstore, but a really good literary bookstore. And the reading for that book was held there on a warm night. I forget, the summer, spring, something like that. And people were spilling into the streets. And he just kind of ambled in and did his thing. And it was for one night, he was the Beatles.
Well, he had discovered a completely new generation of readers with that book, which
Absolutely.
I assume still exists. I hope
it's in print. I hope it's.
Oh,
open.
Absolutely. And that's the last scene of my book, by the way.
Now, a tender subject, maybe. We were talking about this in back there. I hesitate to call it backstage, but back there. And the question is, what of Joe Mitchell's pieces would be possible today? And that's a code word in nonfiction world for which of his techniques could you do now, and would they be flagged by fact checkers, and what are the rules now as opposed to then, and should they be, and all that stuff. Maybe I'll start with Tom on this question. What is your impression of how Joe regarded fiction and the border between fiction and nonfiction, and why?
Well, what David is referencing is if you read Joe Mitchell, and many of you have, of course, you know that one of the hallmarks of his pieces, for instance, is that he has his characters talk in extraordinarily long speeches, monologues, remarkable, that don't happen in real life. And many of his pieces also are constructed in a way, call it a visit, like Mr. Hunter's Grave happens in the course of an afternoon. Well, in truth, Joe probably met with George Hunter 10, 15 times. Had hours and hours and hours and hours of conversation with him. Everything that Mr. Hunter says in the story, he almost certainly said, and he almost certainly said it the way he said it. But Joe would take many of these speeches and fuse them into, one long declamation. And again, he would take, many visits and have them. And that was artistic license. And this was at a time when, frankly, the modern conventions of journalism, which pretty much date maybe to the 50s and beyond, hadn't really, taken... let's just say there was more latitude in a lot of places about that sort of thing. And so... I don't think Joe was terribly unique. I think Joe pushed the boundaries, And I think the New Yorker probably pushed the boundaries as a publication in terms of what may have been acceptable, even, in that time frame. But for Joe, at least, that didn't matter because he was interested in a larger truth, if you will, than, whether the visit happened over 2 or 3 visits as opposed to 1. That didn't matter. What mattered was what got said and conveyed. So I'll stop there, but that's kind of tee it up.
Sandy or Mark?
Well, I think he, it's a rule of writing either fiction or nonfiction. I mean, if it's not fiction based on somebody, that you can say pretty much anything you want if you say the person is really good looking. And I think that with a lot of Joe's pieces, really with all of them, he loved the people that he was writing about.
Right, it wasn't oppositional.
So it's not opposition. It's not like, okay, I'm going to make you look bad. He's making the person look the opposite of bad, and he's seeing him with love and an aesthetic appreciation. And what Mark is talking about with Joe's ability to listen, what those quotes convey is that relationship. This person who's talking has not been listened to, and Mitchell is listening. And that also, I think, sort of justifies the length of it. I think basically it's the affection of it, and also the artistry. If it's so beautiful and unbelievable, you're just not going to stop and go, wait a minute, I want to see the transcripts of this. Because
it's not the point.
It's not the point. I mean, I think he was, I think that the art of it takes it past any kind of, security considerations or, like we're gonna check your tapes and see if we're gonna look at your notebooks and make sure you got all this, some
but now we do.
reason for it.
But now we do, and I think this became more of an issue when oppositional journalism entered the New Yorker and other places in a more vivid way, in longer nonfiction. And therefore, then the rules had to be kind of unified, and a problem like that would be finessed. You would sort of nudge the reader in the ribs and say, and let him or her in on what you were doing. And then it was okay. Mm-hmm. These meetings took place over there. It's very quickly done. And where trouble began was when the old rules of non-oppositional reporting got glommed onto oppositional reporting, and people objected, rightly objected. And that's when I think these things had to get rethought. I mean, it's a tricky thing, especially when you're not just representing yourself, but you're next to another piece in a magazine that's also purporting to be nonfiction. Because if you can make it up, there's a word for that, and there's nothing wrong with it. It's a glorious thing. It's called fiction.
It's a great question, but it's a great question, though, because today Joe literally would not be able, he couldn't do Mr. Hunter's grave that way. He could do it. No doubt it would be a beautiful story.
I think he could
different
do it.
story.
I think he
It'd be a
absolutely
different story.
could do it with a very subtle little fillip about technique that would let him off the hook. And on old Mr. Flood, he had to change. I forget what the story is. I think there was some controversy about this. He in a second edition of this, Tom, you're going to know the details of this better. Told the reader that in fact these pieces are they're composite characters, right, and so on and so forth.
That was never in the original New Yorker.
No, and he kind of comes clean. I don't know what pressure was exerted, or if any, and that doesn't take away my enjoyment of Mr. Flood at all.
Right.
That's the only time he ever said that, and it's reasonable to assume that he did it all along.
Absolutely, I think so.
But when you say that it would be okay, you edit a magazine,
yeah,
right? So you're saying that if a piece came in there, you could publish it in your magazine.
If you're straight with the reader about what you're up to.
Could the New York Times publish it?
I'm not in charge of them.
Well, but it's a question about the New Yorker. Why are we special? In other words, what makes it allowed here but not there? And I think that the whole thing.
I'm not saying it's allowed. I would say that if you published Mr. Hunter's grave and had some very brief passage about what the terms of Mr. Hunter's grave were, and it can be very subtle and fleet, but as long as it's clear, that's one thing. I mean, we've discussed other profile writers, these giant quotes that go on and on and on. And clearly there were questions in between, and there were other things that formed these. There are ways of telling the reader what you're up to. There are ways of doing it, and it's not so terrible. And the price you pay of not doing it is then reading Cy Hirsch next to it, and the reader going, that never happened. He's making that up just like Joe. So part of it is the pressure of having a publication with things side by side. But the last thing I want to do, first of all, is to go on and on about this, but the last thing I want to do is somehow hurt, subjugate, ruin the artistic pleasures of Joe Mitchell, who I revere as much as anybody here. The question is, if you're going to call something nonfiction in a magazine that has a bunch of terms that are going out to the reader has to understand what's going on. Otherwise, you run into deep, deep trouble. With that very sort of hyper-pompous and more serious maybe than we wanted to get into conversation about that point, do you have any questions?
I think there's definitely an influence. He loved the fire and brimstone preachers. It scared the hell out of him, literally, to go to these revivals, but he was mesmerized by them. Then when he came to New York as a reporter for newspapers, he often wrote about African American preachers in particular, and he just, in part because he just loved the rhythm of the way they spoke. So sound was very important to Joe, and the older he got, the more that sense of that rhythmic and the repetition became, a signature of his style. Absolutely. Well, when Joe came to New York, he was, 21. He came literally, it may literally have been that Black Friday. So timing is everything. And he wanted to be a newspaper writer, and that's what he did. He came, he talked himself into a job, and spent the first decade of his life in New York writing newspaper articles, first for the Herald Tribune, great newspaper, and then the World Telegram. And so it's kind of ironic when people talk about Joe Mitchell and the longest writer's block. Joe Mitchell, for the first 10 years of his life, wrote millions and millions and millions of words. He would write 2-3 stories every day for these papers, and newspaper writing. These guys will probably tell you. I mean, that it's a training ground. It lays the foundation, develops discipline, and you learn how to report, and you learn how to listen if you're smart. And 10 years in, he published a book called My Ears Are Bent, which, that's right, and that was sort of the best of his newspaper work up until that time. And so that was hugely important to him. He would not have become the writer he was if he hadn't had that apprenticeship. As for my book, I've just finished the first draft. I've been talking to editors. I'm into revisions, which I hope to have done this summer. So I would hope that it would be out maybe early next year. I'm beginning to appreciate Joe Mitchell and taking years to get something done. Part of the reason Joe stopped being able to publish was there was a series of things in his personal setbacks. He published the last Joe Gould story in late '64. In '63, Joe Liebling, arguably his best friend, died. In '63, his mother died. Move into the early '70s. And it was in that late 60s, early 70s period where he is writing these autobiographical pieces, but he's not publishing them. Then his father dies, and then in the mid-70s, then his wife has a stroke, then has cancer, then she dies, and he's in the throes of depression, and so he's sort of a mindset like, why bother? And these are huge contributions to why he just couldn't get the impetus to get past it.
Thank you very, very much. It was really a delight to hear from all of you. Thank you, Stanley, Tom, and Mark. Thank you.